Hidden within the heart of an ancient forest lay a world untouched by human hands, a place where the natural world and magic coexisted in a delicate harmony. The trees were massive, their trunks as wide as houses, and the canopy so dense that it cast the forest floor in a perpetual twilight, with only streaks of sunlight managing to pierce through the leaves. Moss and ivy blanketed the forest floor, and here, among the shadows and silent clearings, magical creatures thrived. There were creatures that most humans had only read about in old stories. Fairies with shimmering wings that glowed faintly in the dark, tiny goblins with cunning eyes and sly grins, and talking animals of all kinds, from foxes and deer to rabbits and owls. Even the plants seemed to possess a subtle awareness, leaning in to listen as secrets were whispered among the forest residents. And all of these beings, large and small, lived by one unbreakable rule: we don't kill humans. This rule, simple as it sounded, was deeply ingrained in their society. The creatures had established this pact many generations ago, when the elders, wise and ancient beings whose magic was so powerful that even the trees bowed to them, had gathered to discuss the rising number of human sightings near their world. They believed that taking human life, even in self-defense, would invite catastrophe. Humans, though often unaware of their surroundings, possessed the ability to destroy the entire forest with their fire, their machines, and their sheer numbers. Killing one human might seem harmless, but it could draw many more into their sanctuary, bringing with them disaster. To the magical creatures, humans were strange and unpredictable. They could be kind and curious, but also dangerously destructive. So, the elders decreed that all magical creatures would follow the pact, and this law became the foundation of their society, the one rule that none dared to break. Yet now, a troubling development had begun to disturb the forest peace. Over the past few weeks, humans had been leaving more and more traces in the woods. Crushed leaves, broken branches, and footprints that went deeper into the forest than humans had ever dared venture before. The forest elders, who sensed every change in their land, felt a growing unease. This disturbance was unlike anything they'd experienced in recent memory. And so, the creatures held a gathering under the massive willow tree, an ancient tree that served as their meeting place, to discuss what should be done. As the elders assembled, murmurs ran through the crowd. The creatures, large and small, whispered their concerns, wondering if perhaps a change in the rules was needed. But the elders were resolute. They would not alter the pact so easily. It had kept them safe for generations. Yet, something had to be done. After much deliberation, the elders decided that they would send one of their own to investigate the source of these human disturbances. This was not a decision made lightly, as they would be sending one of their own directly into the path of danger. Among the creatures, a young fox named Tilly stepped forward, her golden-brown fur glinting in the dim light. Tilly was known throughout the forest for her speed and agility, but more than that, she had a curiosity and intelligence that set her apart. She was clever and quick-witted, capable of observing from the shadows and piecing together clues. The elders trusted her, for despite her youth, she had a loyalty to the forest and a strong sense of duty. "Are you certain, Tilly?" one of the elders asked, his voice as deep and ancient as the trees. Tilly nodded confidently, though inside she felt a swirl of nerves. "Yes, I'll find out what's drawing the humans here, and I'll make sure they don't disturb our home any further." The elders gave her a solemn nod of approval. "Remember the pact, Tilly. You are to observe, to understand, but never to harm." With a final glance back at the gathering creatures, Tilly set out, her paws light against the forest floor. As she trotted through the trees, her mind filled with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had never encountered a human before, only heard stories. Some creatures described them as frightening, towering beings, while others spoke of their curiosity, their way of reaching out to the world beyond their own understanding. To Tilly, they were as much a mystery as the ancient magic of the forest itself. As she ventured further, the familiar sense of her home began to blend with something foreign. A trace of smoke lingered in the air, the faint smell of metal, and something else she couldn't identify. Tilly felt a thrill of both excitement and dread. It was her duty to protect the forest, to uphold the pact, but the idea of finally seeing a human filled her with an undeniable curiosity. Through the shadows, Tilly crept closer and closer to the source of the scent. Soon, she reached a small clearing, and there, in the dim light, she spotted him, a young human boy, no older than 12, looking lost and disheveled, with wide eyes scanning the forest around him. He was muttering to himself, glancing over his shoulder as though afraid of something unseen. Tilly watched from the cover of the trees, her sharp eyes never leaving the boy. He looked frightened, and though she knew humans could be dangerous, she sensed no malice in him. She crouched, her tail flicking slightly as she considered her next move. The boy, unaware of her presence, stumbled forward, clutching a small bag tightly to his chest. "They can't find me here," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper, filled with fear. Tilly's heart softened a little. Perhaps he wasn't like the other humans she'd heard about. But as she watched him, she sensed something else, a presence in the forest that didn't belong. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. A distant howl echoed through the trees, sending a chill through the air. Without another thought, Tilly darted forward, positioning herself between the boy and the unseen threat, feeling the pack's weight in her bones. She didn't understand exactly why, but something told her that she had to protect him. Tilly crouched in the shadows, her amber eyes fixed on the young human boy before her. He seemed small and frail in this vast forest, his wide blue eyes filled with fear and confusion. His clothes were torn, his knees scuffed, and his dark hair was tangled with leaves and dirt. He looked exhausted, as if he had been wandering for hours, perhaps even days. As she watched him, Tilly's sharp nose picked up the scent of something strange on him, a faint, metallic smell that clung to his clothes. It was the scent of machines, of iron and oil, the kind of scent that had no place in her forest. She shuddered. The boy stumbled over a root, clutching a small bag to his chest as he mumbled under his breath, "They'll never find me here. They'll never find me." His voice was barely a whisper, fragile, as if he was trying to convince himself. Tilly took a careful step closer, curious and cautious. She had never seen a human so young, and her instincts warred with her training. Everything in her upbringing warned her to stay hidden, to keep her distance from humans. But something about the boy drew her in. He looked scared and lonely, so far from his world. As she drew closer, she began to pick up snippets of his scent. Fear mingled with determination. His hands trembled as he looked over his shoulder, scanning the dark trees as though he was being chased by something. Tilly crept even closer, her paws silent on the forest floor, watching his every move. The boy finally slumped down at the base of a tree, resting his head against its rough bark, closing his eyes for a moment. His breathing was heavy, ragged. "They don't understand," he murmured, barely loud enough for her to hear. "The creatures here, they're not like they think." Tilly's ears perked up. What did he mean? Did he understand the forest? Did he know what the other creatures here were? As these questions filled her mind, her heart softened a little more. She crept closer, finally stepping into the light just enough for him to notice her. The boy's eyes snapped open, and he gasped, scrambling back against the tree. Tilly froze, lowering her head in a gesture of calm, trying to show him that she wasn't a threat. She knew he was frightened. Humans always seemed to be when they encountered anything unusual in the forest. But she wasn't just any forest animal. She was one of the guardians, chosen by the elders to protect this world. And now, it seemed, she had found herself protecting this young, lost human. Slowly, the boy relaxed, his curiosity overpowering his fear. "Are you a fox?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Tilly tilted her head, studying him. She was more than just a fox, but to him, she might as well have been a creature out of a fairy tale. She decided to stay silent for now, letting him make sense of her presence on his own. The boy continued to stare at her, his eyes wide with wonder and a hint of awe. She saw his shoulders relax a bit as he seemed to take comfort in her presence. "My name is Max," he said softly, looking at her as if he hoped she might understand. "I didn't want to come here. My dad, he made me come." His voice grew bitter, and Tilly felt a flicker of anger in his tone, one that seemed out of place for someone so young. She sensed that there was more to his story than he was letting on, something that weighed heavily on him. He hesitated, glancing around nervously, as if checking for other unseen presences. Tilly could sense his fear, but it wasn't directed at her. It was something else, something much larger that she didn't yet understand. "My dad's a scientist," Max continued, whispering as though sharing a forbidden secret. He thinks this forest is just another place to study, just a place to explore and collect samples." His voice dropped even lower. "But he doesn't understand what's here. He doesn't see what I see." Tilly's ears twitched with interest. It was rare for humans to see past the ordinary, to understand the magic woven into the fabric of the forest. But Max's words hinted that he saw beyond the ordinary, that he sensed the life in the forest around him. Her heart softened a little more, and she moved a step closer, her eyes meeting his. Max continued, "He brought me here because he thinks I'll learn to love science like him. But I don't want to be here. I didn't want to come." His voice broke a little, his hands clutching his bag even tighter, as if it was the only thing tethering him to safety. In that moment, Tilly understood. Max was caught between two worlds. The world of his father's cold science and the world of the forest's mystery and wonder. She felt a surge of empathy for him. She, too, had felt that conflict, torn between her duty as a guardian and her own curiosity about the humans. But before she could dwell on it, a distant howl cut through the forest, echoing through the trees. It was a chilling sound, low and mournful, yet filled with a sense of danger. Tilly stiffened, every hair on her body standing up as she turned toward the sound. That howl was not from any creature she recognized. It was something foreign, something out of place in her world. Her instincts screamed danger. Max tensed beside her, his eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Tilly took a step forward, positioning herself between him and the direction of the howl. Her heart pounded, but she stood firm, feeling the weight of her duty settle over her like a cloak. The elders had sent her to investigate, and now she felt an even greater responsibility to protect this lost human who had somehow found his way into her care. The howl came again, closer this time. Max pressed himself back against the tree, his face pale. Tilly sensed his terror, his vulnerability, and she knew that the pack demanded her protection, even if it was for a human. There was no question of leaving him now. She would uphold her duty, whatever it took. Taking a deep breath, Tilly turned to Max and nudged his arm gently with her nose, signaling him to follow her. Max looked at her, a flicker of hope replacing the fear in his eyes. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his bag as he fell in a step beside her, trusting her completely. They moved swiftly through the trees, Tilly leading the way, her senses sharp, her ears perked for any sign of the approaching threat. The forest seemed to close in around them, shadows lengthening, branches brushing against them like unseen hands. But with each step, Tilly's resolve grew stronger. She didn't know where this journey would take them, but one thing was clear. She was bound to Max by the ancient law of the forest. As they continued deeper into the woods, Tilly felt the pack's power binding her actions, guiding her steps. She knew this was only the beginning, that the real test of her loyalty and bravery lay ahead. But for now, she was content to lead, to protect, and to guard the life that fate had placed in her care. Back in the hidden valley, tension simmered as rumors of human disturbances spread through the forest like wildfire. Creatures who had lived peacefully for centuries, cloaked in the shadows of the ancient trees, now found themselves feeling exposed and vulnerable. Whispers filled the air, creating a nervous hum that seemed to echo through every branch, bush, and stone. News had reached the elders that strange metal devices, unnatural and cold, had been spotted at the edge of the valley, cleverly hidden but unmistakable to the keen eyes of the magical creatures who called this place home. These metal devices were traps, laid by humans with a precision that showed no respect for the life around them. For generations, The elders had taught their people to avoid the places where humans ventured, and they had successfully managed to keep their world hidden. But now, the humans had broken through. They weren't just wandering anymore. They were exploring, invading. Worse yet, the traps seemed designed to capture and restrain, not just to hurt. It was as if the humans had a calculated plan, a dark curiosity to study the creatures of the forest up close, perhaps even to dissect and understand them, piece by piece. The magical community was in turmoil. For the first time in many years, the creatures began to question the ancient rule, the pact that had held their society together for so long. The elders' words echoed in their minds. We don't kill humans. But what if the humans posed a real threat? What if protecting the forest meant fighting back? If they didn't act soon, their world might be uncovered, and their lives turned into trophies and exhibits in the human world. The creatures gathered under the massive willow tree, the heart of their hidden valley, where the elders awaited them. The elders, each older and wiser than any creature in the forest, stood in a solemn line. They wore expressions of calm authority, but a flicker of uncertainty glinted in their eyes. This was not an ordinary gathering. The crowd was larger than usual, filled with creatures both young and old, from fairies to talking squirrels, each desperate for answers and assurance. Finally, an ancient deer with antlers thick with moss and vines stepped forward. His name was Elder Bramble, the wisest and oldest of the elders. He had seen many seasons, had witnessed countless challenges faced by their community, but never had he seen anything quite like this. Children of the forest, his voice echoed, resonating through the crowd. We gather today under troubled skies. You have heard of the humans who have begun to encroach upon our home. They have left traps and strange devices among us, and our peace, our safety, hangs by a thread. A murmur swept through the crowd, and a young fairy fluttered forward, her wings glinting in the dim light. Elder Bramble, she said, her voice trembling, we've always followed the rule. We've avoided humans. But what if they don't stop? What if they find us and destroy everything? Another voice piped up, this time from a bold goblin with sharp eyes and a raspy voice. Why should we keep following the pact if the humans aren't playing fair? They're putting traps in our home. Maybe it's time to fight back. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Such words were dangerous, rebellious. The pact was more than just a rule. It was a sacred bond, a symbol of their unity and commitment to peace. To question it was to question their very way of life. But the elders could not ignore the growing fear and anger. Elder Bramble closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the community's fear. The pact is not a law of convenience, he said softly. It is the foundation of our existence. Breaking it could bring ruin to us all. But, Elder, spoke up a wise old owl named Orin, perhaps the pact should not be so rigid. We have protected the humans, hidden from them, out of respect. But these humans, they come not with curiosity, but with malice and disrespect. Surely, there must be a way to protect ourselves without breaking our values. The crowd fell silent, absorbing Orin's words. The creatures were torn, caught between loyalty to their ancient rule and the instinct to defend their home. Finally, after a long pause, Elder Bramble nodded slowly, his gaze sweeping over the gathering. You speak truth, Orin, he said thoughtfully. The pact binds us, but it does not mean we are helpless. We must defend ourselves, but we must not be the ones to strike first. To break the pact is to break the trust we have held with the very magic that sustains us. A collective sigh of relief and frustration mixed swept through the crowd. The elders, it seemed, would not approve an attack on the humans, but they had given their permission for defense. It was a fragile balance, one that could tip at any moment. Meanwhile, far from the willow tree, Tilly and Max continued their journey deeper into the forest. Max had been telling Tilly about his father's obsession with the forest. He explained in a low, bitter voice how his father, a renowned scientist, believed that the creatures of the forest were the key to unlocking a new era of biological understanding. Max described how his father had hired a team of researchers and trackers to set up traps, all to capture these mystical specimens. He doesn't care about them, Max whispered, his voice filled with a sadness that Tilly hadn't expected. To him, they're just things to study, not creatures with lives with their own homes. I told him that it's wrong, but he doesn't listen. As Max spoke, Tilly felt a pang of sympathy for the boy. She could see that he wasn't like his father. There was kindness in him, a curiosity that wasn't tinged with greed or malice. She sensed that Max's loyalty to his father was conflicting with his love for the forest, creating a storm of emotions that left him feeling torn and helpless. As the day wore on, Tilly noticed the glint of metal ahead. She slowed, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a trap, cleverly disguised but all too clear to her trained eyes. It was a steel cage with sharp, unforgiving bars, hidden beneath leaves and branches. Max's eyes widened as he saw it, and he fell silent, a look of horror spreading across his face. That's one of my father's traps," he whispered, his face pale. "He's really doing this." Tilly felt a surge of protectiveness over Max, who seemed heartbroken by the sight. She nudged him gently with her nose, as if to reassure him. But she knew that these traps were a dangerous sign of what was to come. If the humans succeeded in capturing any of the magical creatures, it could be the end of their world as they knew it. With Max's help, Tilly managed to dismantle the trap, carefully prying the metal parts loose and covering the area with leaves to hide their work. They continued their journey, silently moving from one trap to another, disarming and hiding each device. As they worked, Tilly realized that she wasn't just protecting her world from humans. She was protecting Max from his father's actions, too. She could see how much he was hurting, how deeply he was affected by his father's disregard for the forest. But with each trap they disabled, the danger grew. She knew they were playing a risky game. The humans wouldn't stop. They were persistent, determined to uncover the secrets of the forest, no matter the cost. As night began to fall, Tilly and Max reached a small clearing, exhausted and weary. They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. The darkness seemed thicker than usual, filled with a heavy tension that pressed down on them. Somewhere in the distance, they heard the howl again, the same eerie, foreign sound that Tilly had heard before. Max shivered beside her, his eyes wide with fear. "They're getting closer, aren't they?" Tilly nodded, her gaze steady but her heart racing. She knew the elders were right. They couldn't break the pact, couldn't strike first. But she also knew that they were running out of time. The forest was changing, the ancient peace beginning to unravel. And Tilly could feel the weight of destiny pressing down on her, a whisper in the night that told her their world was on the brink of something dangerous and unknown. The forest had grown silent, an unsettling stillness that made every leaf and twig seem to hold its breath. Tilly and Max moved cautiously through the underbrush, their senses sharp, attuned to the slightest sound. Night had fallen, and the forest was draped in shadows, illuminated only by the silvery light of the moon filtering through the canopy. But something felt wrong, a darkness that went beyond the mere absence of light. As they crept forward, Tilly felt her fur bristle with a sense of impending danger. She could sense that they were close to the humans' camp, their machines and equipment tainting the purity of the forest with metallic smells and unnatural sounds. Max had fallen quiet, a grim look on his face as he led the way, his fingers nervously clutching the strap of his small, worn bag. He seemed torn between loyalty to his father and his newfound understanding of the forest and its creatures. They finally came upon the edge of the camp. The sight before them made Tilly's heart sink. Tents had been set up in a wide clearing, illuminated by harsh, artificial lights that cut through the dark with a clinical, white glow. Equipment and machinery lay scattered around, much of it unfamiliar to Tilly, but unmistakably human. She could smell the cold, sterile scent of metal, oil, and plastic, the scent of a world far removed from the earthy fragrance of moss, leaves, and dew. Max stood frozen, staring at the scene with wide eyes. Tilly could see the conflict in his face, the pain in his gaze as he looked upon his father's camp, realizing the extent of the damage being done. Here was his father, a man he had looked up to, invading the forest with no regard for the creatures that called it home. But it wasn't just the tents and machinery that caught Tilly's attention. Near the center of the clearing, she spotted something that filled her with a deep dread. A series of steel cages, each containing a frightened, magical creature. A small family of fairies huddled together in one cage, their delicate wings drooping as they glanced around in terror. A lone goblin with wide, frightened eyes clutched the bars of another cage, muttering angrily under his breath. Even a talking squirrel, normally so lively and mischievous, sat motionless, his little paws pressed against the cold metal of his prison. Max's hands trembled as he looked at the cages, a sickened expression on his face. "No, this wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered, barely audible. "Dad said he just wanted to observe. He didn't tell me he'd capture them." Tilly nudged him gently, sensing his distress. She knew that they couldn't wait. They had to act quickly if they were to free the creatures. But she also knew that freeing them was only half the battle. They had to do it without drawing attention or risk the wrath of the humans, especially Max's father, who would undoubtedly do everything in his power to recapture the creatures and continue his work. "Max," Tilly whispered, her voice calm and steady, though her heart was racing. "We need to work together. Can you open the cages quietly?" Max nodded, determination flickering in his eyes as he took a deep breath. He glanced around, noticing the camp was temporarily deserted. The humans had likely gone deeper into the forest to set up more traps. Taking advantage of their absence, Max carefully approached the first cage, his fingers fumbling as he worked on the lock. Tilly kept a sharp lookout, her ears pricked for any sign of movement. She knew that, at any moment, the humans could return. But she also knew that if they didn't act now, the captured creatures might not survive. The elders had warned her never to harm a human, and she intended to honor the pact. But her heart ached at the sight of her fellow forest creatures in chains. With a click, the lock sprang open, and Max carefully lifted the latch. The fairies inside looked up, their expressions a mix of fear and hope. Tilly gave them a reassuring nod, gesturing for them to leave quickly but quietly. They slipped out of the cage, their wings fluttering weakly, and vanished into the shadows of the forest, disappearing like wisps of light. One by one, Max moved from cage to cage, releasing the creatures. The goblin grumbled as he was freed, muttering something about humans and their meddling before darting off into the darkness. The squirrel chittered a quick thanks to Tilly before scampering up a nearby tree, disappearing into the safety of the branches. Just as they were finishing, a distant voice rang out. Max's heart skipped a beat. He recognized his father's voice, calling out orders to his team. They were returning. "Hurry!" Max whispered urgently to Tilly, glancing around for any other creatures they might have missed. But the cages were empty, and the creatures they had freed had melted back into the forest, vanishing as if they had never been there. They quickly retreated into the shadows, hiding behind a fallen log as Max's father and his team emerged from the trees, their flashlights sweeping across the clearing. They stopped short, noticing the open cages and empty campsite. Max's father's face twisted in confusion, then anger as he turned to his team. "Who did this?" he snapped, his voice cold and harsh. "We set these traps for a reason. Do you know how important these specimens are?" One of the team members shook his head, just as puzzled. "No one was here, Dr. Brooks. The creatures, they must have been let out somehow." Max watched his father's reaction, a pang of guilt and betrayal coursing through him. But he couldn't bear to see the creatures imprisoned, especially after learning so much about the forest and its hidden world. The man standing in the clearing, yelling at his team, was not the father he had once admired. This was someone blinded by ambition, by the relentless pursuit of discovery without regard for the lives he impacted. Tilly felt Max's turmoil and nudged him gently, reminding him of their pact, their shared mission. She knew he was risking everything to help her, to protect the forest, even if it meant standing against his own family. Dr. Brooks continued to pace, fury etched into his features. "Spread out. Whoever did this can't have gone far. And be on the lookout for any unusual creatures. We'll capture them again, if it's the last thing we do. Max gripped Tilly's fur tightly, his heart pounding as he realized his father wasn't going to give up. He was determined to exploit the forest, no matter the cost, and Max knew that as long as he stayed with him, the danger would continue. As Dr. Brooks and his team spread out, Max whispered to Tilly, "We have to go deeper. Find a place where they can't follow. If we stay close, they'll find us. And I can't go back to him. Not if he keeps doing this." Tilly gazed at him, her eyes soft with understanding. She knew the gravity of Max's choice, choosing to leave his father, to protect a world that humans like his father could never understand. With a small nod, she began to lead him deeper into the forest, away from the humans' bright lights and harsh voices, into the safety of the ancient woods. As they moved silently through the trees, Tilly felt a strange bond forming between them, a connection deeper than mere duty or loyalty. Max had proven himself to be more than just a human. He was someone who understood, who shared her love for the forest and its creatures. And for that, she would protect him with her life. Behind them, the sounds of the humans faded, their voices and footsteps growing distant. The forest, sensing that one of its own had been protected, seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. The night air grew cool and quiet, the distant sounds of creatures scurrying and birds calling filling the silence left by the humans. For the first time, Max felt at peace, walking beside Tilly under the sheltering trees. He knew the journey ahead would be difficult, that they would face dangers he couldn't yet imagine. But as he looked at Tilly, he felt a newfound strength, a certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Together, they would protect the forest and everything in it, bound by a pact stronger than any law or promise, a pact of trust, loyalty, and friendship. The morning sun rose over the forest, casting golden light through the mist that clung to the trees, creating a serene, ethereal glow. But there was no peace in Tilly's heart. She and Max had spent the night hidden deep within the forest, far from the humans' camp, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they were found. The humans were relentless in their pursuit. Tilly could feel it in the earth itself, the vibrations of their footsteps, the hum of their machines, creeping closer, tearing through the forest's sacred silence. Max sat beside her, his face pale and weary, yet filled with a grim determination. He had left behind everything he knew, his father, his home, his life outside the forest. And for what? To protect a world that most humans considered little more than a collection of mysteries to solve, puzzles to pick apart. But Max had come to understand that the forest was more than just trees and creatures. It was a living, breathing entity with its own magic, history, and soul. And now, he was ready to do whatever it took to protect it. They traveled quietly, moving through the dense undergrowth with practiced stealth. Tilly's ears were constantly alert, swiveling at the slightest sound, her senses heightened by the danger they faced. As they walked, she noticed Max glancing over his shoulder, his face tight with worry. He hadn't spoken much since they'd left the camp, but Tilly knew he was struggling with a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, fear, hope. After a while, they reached a secluded glade deep in the heart of the forest. It was a place untouched by human hands, a sacred spot where even the oldest trees grew in reverent silence. Here, the air was thick with magic, the very ground humming with a quiet power that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the forest itself. Tilly could feel it vibrating under her paws, filling her with a sense of calm and purpose. Max glanced around, awestruck by the beauty of the glade. I didn't know places like this existed," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder. Tilly looked at him with soft, understanding eyes. She could sense that this place was as much a revelation to him as it had been to her the first time she had entered it. The glade was known only to a select few, a place where the forest magic was at its most potent. It was here Tilly realized that they would make their stand. Just as the thought crossed her mind, a rustling sound reached her ears. She tensed, turning to see a group of creatures emerging from the shadows. The elders had arrived. Elder Bramble, with his grand, moss-covered antlers, led the group, his ancient eyes gazing upon Tilly and Max with a mixture of solemnity and kindness. Behind him stood other familiar faces, Orin the owl, with his wise, watchful eyes, the fairies who had been freed the night before, hovering in the air with wings that sparkled like sunlight on water, and even the squirrel Tilly and Max had saved, chittering nervously but resolutely by Orin's side. The elders approached slowly, their expressions grave. Tilly could feel the weight of their gaze, the judgment, the questions. She knew they had come not only to protect the forest, but to assess whether the pact would hold. For generations, it had been their guiding principle. We don't kill humans. Yet now the forest was under threat, its very existence hanging by a thread. Could the pact be preserved in the face of such danger? Elder Bramble was the first to speak, his voice deep and steady, like the roots of the ancient trees. Tilly Max, he began, his gaze shifting from one to the other. We are here because the time has come for a choice. The humans threaten our world, yet our laws forbid us from taking life. We cannot break the pact without risking the very essence of what we are. Max swallowed, a look of determination flashing in his eyes. Then maybe there's another way, he said quietly. My father, he doesn't understand what this forest is. He thinks it's just a place to study, a place filled with creatures and mysteries he can capture and analyze. But if he saw what I've seen, if he felt the magic here, maybe he'd understand. Maybe he'd listen. The creatures murmured amongst themselves, doubtful but curious. Elder Bramble nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. What you suggest is dangerous. Max, humans have shown time and again that they fear what they do not understand. But if there is even a small chance, we must consider it. Max's heart pounded as he stepped forward, looking the elder directly in the eye. Let me talk to him. Let me show him what this place is. If he sees the magic here, if he realizes how alive this forest is, maybe he'll change. Maybe he'll leave it in peace. The fairies exchanged nervous glances, and Orin ruffled his feathers, clearly skeptical. But Tilly, standing by Max's side, felt a swell of pride for her companion. He was willing to risk everything for the forest, even facing his father's wrath and disbelief. She could see that his loyalty to her and to the creatures of the forest had grown stronger than the ties to his old life. After a long silence, Elder Bramble gave a slow nod. Very well, he said softly. We will give you this chance, Max. But know this. If you fail, the humans will bring ruin upon us all. The pact will hold, but we cannot stand idly by if our home is destroyed. Max nodded, determination flashing in his eyes. With Tilly at his side, he made his way back toward the humans' camp. His heart was a mix of fear and hope, knowing that his father's understanding, or lack of it, would decide the fate of the entire forest. Tilly trotted alongside him, her body tense, her senses on high alert. She knew that this was the moment everything had been leading to. She had to trust in Max, in the bond they had formed, and in the strength of the forest's magic. As they approached the clearing, they saw Dr. Brooks and his team, busy setting up more traps, their faces focused and intense. Max took a deep breath, his heart racing, and stepped into the clearing, raising his hand to get his father's attention. Dad, he called, his voice trembling slightly. Dr. Brooks looked up, surprise flashing across his face. Max, what are you doing here? Max glanced at Tilly, who watched silently from the edge of the clearing. Dad, you have to stop this. The creatures here, they're not just animals. They're alive in ways you can't imagine. They have their own world, their own magic. If you just stop and listen, you'd see it too. Dr. Brooks frowned, his expression turning stern. Max, this is nonsense. These are rare specimens, yes, but they're just animals. We're here to learn, to make discoveries that could change the world. But at what cost? Max shouted, his voice growing desperate. Dad, you're tearing this place apart. There's so much you don't understand. So much you're destroying. Dr. Brooks hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Max seized the moment, stepping closer. Please, just look around. Really look. If you open your eyes, you'll see the magic here. A hush fell over the clearing. For the first time, Dr. Brooks looked around, really looked. The trees seemed to shimmer faintly in the morning light, and the air was thick with the hum of unseen energy. Slowly, the creatures of the forest emerged from the shadows, surrounding the clearing. Fairies, goblins, and animals alike watched in silence, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Dr. Brooks' face softened as he took it all in, as if a veil had been lifted. The realization dawned on him slowly, a mixture of awe and shame filling his eyes. "Max, I didn't know." Max's voice was soft but firm. "Now you do. So please let them be. They have a right to live here, just as much as we do." Dr. Brooks turned to his team, his voice filled with a new resolve. "Pack up the equipment. We're leaving. This forest, it isn't ours to take." A cheer went up among the creatures, their relief palpable. Tilly felt the weight lift from her shoulders, a warmth spreading through her as the pact held strong. Max had succeeded where violence and anger would have failed, bridging the gap between two worlds with courage and compassion. As the humans packed up and disappeared from the forest, the creatures gathered around Max and Tilly, gratitude shining in their eyes. Elder Bramble stepped forward, bowing his head in respect. "You have honored the pact, Max. The forest owes you a debt." Max smiled, looking at Tilly with a warmth that went beyond words. He had found a new home here, a purpose that was deeper than any he'd known before. And together, he and Tilly had proven that sometimes understanding and respect could triumph over fear and destruction.